Hi everybody, I'm Lisa from ProWritingAid, and thank you for another session in the Fantasy Writers Week promotion schedule of events. My guest today is TJ Klune. TJ, are you there?
I am, thank you. Hi.
Great. Okay, so TJ reached the USA Today and New York Times bestseller list last year with his book, The House in the Cerulean Sea, and I was just talking to him a bit before we came live. I cannot tell you how much I loved it. It's funny, it's poignant, it made me cry. It's full of wonder, which is one of the things that we've been talking about a lot this week. And I sort of feel like there's something in it for everyone. My book club loved it. My kids loved it. My mom, who's in her 70s, loved it. It's magical. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for writing it. I could spend the next hour sort of just talking about the book, but I'm going to pull myself back because what we have here actually is a whole audience of fantasy writers, and what they're really interested in is your journey from just being some guy to becoming a New York Times bestselling author. So let's talk about that. Did you always want to be a writer?
Yeah, I did. When I was a kid, I used to carry this notebook around with me, like when I was 6 or 7 years old, and then I'd write stories with it about everything that I could think of, everything that would just come into my head. And it was absolute and utter nonsense. But it wasn't until I reached seventh grade that I learned the power of the written word, because I had I grew up in a very poor rural area where there was not a lot of opportunities afforded to a loudmouth, effeminate kid like myself. And it was, I kind of hid the fact that I wrote. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell my family until we got to seventh grade, when in my seventh grade English class, there was two of my teachers, Mrs. Benson, Mrs. Pfeiffer. They gave us this assignment where we had to write down a memory and turn it into a story, and then they would read it, and then they would grade it and give it back to us. And I remember being so nervous. I don't remember what I wrote about, but I remember very distinctly turning it in with my folder and then watching out of the corner of my eye as my New Kids on the Block folder got higher and higher towards the top. And then once they started reading it, I was panicking, but then they started laughing and chuckling, and they told me at the very end of that day that one day that they would see my name on a book in a bookstore. And I have never forgotten them. That was the power of two teachers that basically set me on the path where I am today.
Oh, I've got goosebumps. That's amazing. I mean, have you always written fantasy, or has it been
No,
also?
I've written The House in the Cerulean Sea. When that came out in March of 2020, that was actually my 25th book. I
Oh,
have
wow.
been around for this year is actually my 10th anniversary of my first book coming out in August of 2011. And I've written everything from contemporary to science fiction to fantasy, which is my one and true great love. But the through line for all of my books is that they are about queer people from all walks of life. But I have found my home in fantasy because that's what I loved reading when I was a kid, and that's what I love writing now.
I'm sure there's lots of people that are watching that and nodding in their living rooms at home. So how did you learn to write then? How did you go from just, hiding by yourself and writing in your notebooks to
I
learning your craft?
I think the biggest thing that at least that started me on the road was reading. Reading was a lifesaver for someone like me. We were so poor that we couldn't afford books. Like, my parents would not buy us books, so my savings grace was the my library card, and I would spend every day during the summer biking into town to go to the library, and I would read anything I could get my hands on. It didn't matter if it was fiction, didn't matter if it was nonfiction, it didn't matter if it was far above my reading level. I read everything, and that is basically how I learned to write. Not because I wanted to copy other people and how they wrote, but I took little bits and pieces from all these different authors that I loved and read, and that brought me hope and joy, and just kind of turned it into my own voice, my own style. Is that a perfect way to do it? No, absolutely not. But I did not go to college. I did not go to I am a a community college dropout. That is as far as my education goes. But I think that not only through reading, it was through sheer force of will that I wanted to do this, because when you're a kid and you're 6, 7 years old and you think about all the things you want to do, you want to be an archaeologist, you want to be an astronaut, you want to do all these things. I wanted to be a writer from when I was a kid. From the very first day, I could think of stuff like that. I knew I wanted to be a writer and I knew I wanted to tell stories. And so I just worked my butt off to be able to do that. And it's worked out so far so well, I think.
Yeah, so far pretty good. I mean, we often say that to writers, that I think people feel like you that writers are born, but it's practice, isn't it? And it's figuring things out and it's
Yeah.
learning how to tell your story and
And it's also understanding that not everything that you do is going to come out completely. I mean, I can't tell you how many trunk novels I have that I've started, got halfway through, or even completed that will just never see the light of day because frankly, they're not very good. And that is such a trial and error process in order to, especially when you're first starting out and you're trying to find your voice, you're trying to find your sense of style, you're trying to find who you want to be as a writer. You are going to make you are going to write so much stuff that will never ever see the light of day, and that's okay. That is absolutely okay to do.
that's how you learn.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So are you a planner or are you a pantser? Do you outline or do you just sit down and see where it takes you?
I have ADHD, so just going and seeing where it takes me can lead to some very weird books where nothing quite makes sense and it's kind of all over the place. So I typically tend to work from an outline. That being said, my outlines are not, I'm not beholden to them. I don't, they are not the be all and end all. I always want to make sure I give myself wiggle room to work. And it really does depend upon the book that I'm writing. With fantasy, I typically have very extensive outlines because there's a lot of world building that you have to do. And I want to make sure that I'm hitting all the right notes. But I can't tell you how many times my outline ends up looking nothing like the book when it comes out, like I reach the end, because an outline should be just that, at least for me, is just an outline. It's the bones of a house and I get to fill in the interior however I want.
Do you usually know where it's gonna end up? Do you know your ending point?
Yes, I am one of those
Route?
who, for some reason, I know my beginning and I usually know my ending, and it's the middle part that I have to do that. But I also want to make sure that I'm not cemented in that too, because stories change on you when you write them. And if you have one idea and you stick with it all the way through, great, that's awesome. I can't do that because it feels like I'm stifling myself. So if I have an ending in mind, I keep that in mind, but I also do that with the knowledge that maybe that's going to change. And maybe 50% of the time it does, 50% of the time it doesn't. And either way, it totally works for me.
Cool. Okay, great. Um, so I've got a few. There's lots of things that we've been talking about this week: plots, characters, world building, editing, that sort of thing. So I've just got a bit of a list of things that we've talked about in our sessions that I just want
Mm-hmm.
to ask you about. So let's talk about characters. So what's your process for developing characters?
Characters are the first thing, because typically, let's say for House in the Cerulean Sea, for example, I got the idea for that story because the main character Linus just would not shut up in my head. I didn't know what the story was going to be about, but I knew that the House in the Cerulean Sea and Linus itself, he would be he sounded very stuffy, very proper, very prim, and that it almost instantly I knew he was going to be a rule follower. And I just let him kind of percolate for a little bit, and that's just how it happens with me. And when I finally understood his voice for what it was, I started thinking about what other voices would be around him, what other characters would be around him. And then all of a sudden I started hearing other little voices which weren't on the same level as him. So I wondered if they were going to be children for some reason. And then it got to the idea, okay, he has to do some kind of work with children. He's a rule follower and there's children involved. And that's typically how it works for me. I typically, with characters, I'll hear one and they're usually the loudest, which means they're going to be the main character. And then I will tend to just build off that and see if it goes somewhere. Sometimes nothing comes from it because I don't hear any other characters or how they would interact around them, and they just kind of eventually fade away. But Linus was very, very loud. And I'm so pleased that I was able to write his story.
I mean, he's such a good character, and
Thank you.
I just,
I'm very protective of him as a character.
well, I mean, I
I
feel like
love
that
him.
too.
Yeah.
He's not even my character, and I feel sort of protective of him as a character.
Thank you. I hope that if people who've read it, they feel that way about him, because he deserves that kind of protection. I think he's very precious to me.
Yeah. Well, and as I read it, I realized that I couldn't really think of an of a fantasy, sort of joyful fantasy story that had as its main love story two slightly eccentric, awkward middle-aged men.
Hmm.
I hadn't seen it before, and I
We
loved
don't
it.
get to see that a whole lot. When you think fantasy, it's either going to be grimdark fantasy where everything is swords and shields and mud and everything's down in the dirt, or it's going to be magic and witches and all that kind of thing. But typically these days, fantasy is built around either it's in YA where the characters are teenagers, or it's going to be 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. But life doesn't stop when in if or when you reach a certain age. And I'm myself, I'm going to be 40 in a couple of years, and I want to see characters like myself of my age getting to have the same kind of adventures that characters of younger ages get to have. And I think it's important to be able to have that, especially in fantasy, especially to have a portly queer man in his 40s be the main character, because we don't get to see that in fantasy. We don't get to see that. And I think that's important that we get to tell those stories too.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get to see it very often anyway, but
Yeah.
particularly in fantasy, I think. Kristen says, she says, "Oh my God, I thought the voices in were just me headed toward in my head, headed towards crazy land."
No, no, absolutely not. It's honestly, writing is if I didn't have writing, maybe it would turn into something like Crazy Land, but writing is my outlet for those voices. And I'm glad to hear that it's the same for others.
Well, and I love that you start with a character and then just build out from it, and then it
Hmm.
becomes
Yeah,
story.
I typically build the world around the characters, because these characters have to live in this world, and if I know what kind of a person they are and what they act like, or and why they are the way they are, then that way I can understand how they react to the world around them. So it's, for me, it's always character first and then the world after that, because if you can't endear yourself to a character, if a reader is not endearing themselves to that character, then they're not going to necessarily care about the world itself either.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting because we were talking to Dave Farland earlier this week, and
Hmm.
his theory is that you should start with the world
Hmm.
because that's going to form your characters. And
Yeah.
I think it just feeds into the idea that every writer has their process, right?
Yeah, so you could take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, because if it doesn't work for you, then it doesn't work for you. And if you want to go the direction that Dave suggested, that's totally acceptable too. This is just how it works for me.
Yeah, okay. Well, so let's talk about your world. When you built the world of the house in the Cerulean Sea, do you is it an iceberg for you? Like, have we seen just a tiny bit of the iceberg that's coming up above the water, and is do you know all about the world that's
Oh
underneath?
yeah, I know this, because this book was always going to be narrowly focused on Linus and his journey, his character arc. How he starts at the beginning is not how he is at the end. There is a great big wide world around them, and I think that's, you're given plenty of hints about that throughout the book. Um, and it's something that I wrestled with at first, because I didn't want to get too distracted away from Linus himself, because Linus is, his arc is the most important thing about, to me, about this book, going from a bland bureaucratic everyman who thinks that that's what his life is and that he has nothing else more for himself, to be able to go to a world that is filled with bright and color and joy and happiness, and that he gets to get that family for himself. It to me, this book was never going to be a big huge adventure with this world-shaking, world-altering things. It was going to be a quiet story about a quiet man who finds himself a home. And that's always what I thought about at first. Whenever I was writing, whenever my through line for The House in the Cerulean Sea was, it has to be about Linus. Yes, these great bigger things may happen around him, but never ever forget that this is Linus's journey and I'm just the one taking him on it. So I love characters. I love character building. I love characters, just seeing how they react to each other. And I don't know, there's just something so special about that just enchants me when I get to do it.
Yeah, well, then I think it's so easy to get distracted from that line, your
Mm-hmm.
focus, especially if you're creating this world. Like in your head, I'm sure all of these magical kids grow into magical adults, and where are they in the world? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm sort of desperate to know, but also it
Yeah,
doesn't really matter for the
right.
story.
In the book, because the main crux of the book is that he works for the department in charge of magical youth, and there is one line in the book where it's hinted at that there's a department in charge of magical adults too, and that is just a whole nother world that
Oh, I want
exists
to know about
outside
that world.
that exists outside of Linus and his adventure. And it for a time I struggled with the idea of, should it be more than that? And is it wrong to drop hints that there is a greater, bigger world outside of just this? But that's how life is. There's so much, going on outside of our own existence that we just get hints about. And so it felt appropriate just to keep it that way.
Well, and is it, I mean, I feel desperate to know about it, but I don't feel unsatisfied
Yeah.
by it. Dissatisfied? Unsatisfied? Um, I need my editing in my editing hat in there. But I feel like it would be quite easy if you gave too much information to make it feel like it's relevant. It's important, and then you would feel like you wanted more of it, and it wouldn't tie up in the same sort of way. But if you just give a tiny bit, does that make it easier?
Yeah, because I think it's basically you're giving somebody an appetizer in addition to giving them the full meal that they already have, instead of two big, full, huge meals that makes them feel full and bloated and blah. And um, I like focused narratives. I like focused stories where there may be hints about something grander, something bigger going on, but we're following these characters and not that specific story. And yes, other things are going on in the world around them, and maybe one day we'll find out what those are. But as for right now, this is about Linus. This is about him and what he's doing and the change that he wants to see in the world.
I love that. So we talked a little bit before we came on about editing. Let's talk
Mm.
editing, because I asked a question in our Facebook group about who loved editing and who hated editing, and it was about 50-50. So where are you on that spectrum?
I love editing. I love
Yes.
editing. I love it so, so much.
So
It's
why? Tell us why.
So look, um, writing is very personal. It feels very personal. You're putting your heart and your soul into what you're writing, and if whether it's your first book or your 25th, it is something when you putting your words down onto a page, it feels like you're leaving part of yourself on that page. And so when you get to the editing process, it can feel like somebody's chipping away at yourself. It can feel like they're but I put that word there because I love that word. The reason this character said that is because I wanted them to say that. Why do you want to change that? You cannot be so in love with what you've written that you feel that way when it comes time for change. Editing, when you have a good editor, editing exists to make your story the best it can be. It is there to make your story shine, and it'll show you things that you didn't even think of from points of view outside of yourself, because you're too close to your work. It's very hard to divorce yourself from your own story, but that's something that you kind of have to do in order to be able to become a working author, to work with an editor who literally just wants to make your story better. Are there not so great editors out there? Yeah, sure. But my editor, my main editor that I have right now, her name is Ali. She is the absolute best thing that has ever happened in my writing career, because she not only gets me as a writer, but she wants me to be the best I can be. And so when she gives me an idea, or she says something like, yeah, I saw that comment. Yeah, no editing is evil. But when she sends me a note, like for the past 2 months, I've been finishing up on edits for my next book that comes out in September. And when that book is hugely personal to me because it deals with the topic of death and grief. And when she wrote back, and her first note was, I may bump up against something that might hurt you in the editing unintentionally, so please don't take offense, just know that I'm wanting to make the story the best it can be. And with that advice, I was able to put this distance between myself and the story and go through it and see her edits for what they were. You can't be so in love with your own words that you can't get rid of them, because that's how editing is. Editing is getting rid of the not good and making it better. And I know that can be very tough for a writer. I know that because I've been there. My first few edits that I went through, I had a chip on my shoulder where I was like, I did this, so obviously I must have to want it there. What do you mean you want to change this? Do you not understand my book? That's so self-defeating that it will hurt you in the long run. It'll end up hurting you in the long run. That doesn't mean that you can't push back on certain things. I do that all the time with my editor. If I don't agree with something she says, we can have back and forth. We may bring in another person to get their idea. And if two people are against something that I'm saying, chances are I'm probably wrong. And so I'll probably go with them. But
it's hard though. It's hard
let
to
let yourself step back from your work and think about it with a clear head.
And how much editing and revision do you do on your own first draft before you send it off to an editor?
So I will write my book from beginning, middle, and end, and rarely edit as I'm writing. I don't like to do that because it kind of distracts my creative process and my flow. I write, and if I'm writing and something changes or I decide to abandon a certain plot line or something like that, I just comment on my manuscript and say, remember to come back here, change this, change this, change this. And then I step away from it. When I finish, I don't look at it for like a month. I don't look at it for like maybe even up to 6 weeks. And then I'll go back to it and I'll do, probably, depending upon how complex the book is, probably 2 to 3 rewrites for each book. And it helps for me. And again, this is just for me, but it helps me editing to print out the entire manuscript and then retype the entire thing, reading it off the manuscript, because that way I'm reading and writing, and so it hits differently for me when I'm reading what I'm rewriting. And then once I finish with that, I have 3 beta readers that I send it to, and they take it and they give all of their opinions. I get that back and I rewrite it again based upon their thoughts and comments and what they thought needed to be changed or what worked. And then I send it to my agent and she puts her thoughts in it, and then I do another rewrite, and then it's off to the editor for the first time.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, I think that's what we hear from our users all the time, is that they get to their end of their first draft and they're like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know where to go next. I'll just send it to an editor and they'll fix it all.
No,
it's cheating, isn't it?
It is. It is a little bit, because you're missing a couple of important steps, and not necessarily about beta readers or agents or anything like that. But when you finish, again, this is for me and how I do it. But when you finish, don't look at it again. Don't look at it again for weeks. Take a step back. Start writing something new. Start working on something different. Come back to it after you've had time to maybe not remember every single little detail of what you've written, and then reread it and see if it still feels the same way. Because if you write something beginning, middle, and end, finish it, and immediately go back and start doing everything all over again, you're still in the mindset of the story in this world, and everything you've written is perfect and as it should be because you wrote it. And it's so much better to get distance, because distance can give you clarity that you may not have had before.
Yeah, well, and I think you often know what you meant to say, and so you read it knowing what you meant to say. Whereas if you've got a bit of distance, you can read it seeing if you actually got across what you meant.
Right, exactly. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to a story that I wrote. Sure, it's going to be just great. And then get to a part, I'm like, what the hell was I thinking when I was writing right here? This doesn't make any sense. What is this? And then
Yeah.
it just really helps to get distance is one of the writer's best friends when it comes to finishing a book, man. Distance, give
Yeah.
yourself time to step away so you can come back with clear eyes.
Well, and I think that's big picture true for sure. Like you can see your plot holes, you can see
Mm-hmm.
inconsistencies, but I think it's true down to like the sentence level. Like I'm really bad for writing really long meandering sentences that just go on and have five different ideas in them. That makes sense to me when I'm reading it because I know
Mm-hmm.
the rhythm of the sentence. But going back and trying to read it again, I'm like, what?
Yeah,
Break this and
I'm a
just
big
really.
fan of run-on sentences, as my editors can attest. It's because I'm like, well, my brain is just keep on going. You know, why
Yeah.
use a period when you can have a
Just
comma? It's just or an M dash. It's just so good.
oh, an M dash.
I love the M
I
dash.
love M dash.
A little too much.
Yeah. So okay. So I think everybody, did you hear that? Editing, self-editing, revision is your friend. Learn to love it. Don't be afraid of it. That's where a lot of the magic happens, right?
It is. And there are so many, obviously we're on a resource right now, but there are so many resources to be able to help with editing. And when I was talking earlier about reading books that made me want to become a writer, and reading is fundamental, I think, for writing, not just fiction too. Make sure you're reading books about writing. Like I think one of the best books about writing is Stephen King's On Writing is a tremendous piece of work when it comes to writing. He was already my favorite author since I was 12 years old, but On Writing has been um, hugely influential on how I found my voice in writing. So if you haven't read that, I really recommend people read that book.
Yeah, I have it somewhere. I was just looking to see if it's on my bookshelf
Yeah, I
somewhere,
have
but I
so
can't
many
see that.
copies of that book, dog-eared and everything like that, because I have different copies for different things that I've highlighted in them, so I can just refer back to. And it's still something I still read. Look, yes, I've written 25 books. Yes, I've been doing this for 10 years. Yes, I was very lucky that my most recent book got on the New York Times bestseller list, but I still learn every single day so I learn something new, and that's never gonna. I don't ever want that to stop. I want to be able to learn every single day, no matter how long my writing career lasts.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that cool about writing? Like, I just don't
Mm-hmm.
think you ever get to the end point where you're like, well, I now know everything about writing. Nobody ever
Yeah,
gets there.
no, it's because it just, what else is there after if that happens?
Yeah.
What else? The whole point of being alive is that we get to learn new stuff, and that I love that. You know, even when I'm like, oh well, I just learned that I should not have written that the way I did.
Yeah. Oh, great. Now you know. All right. Next on my list is publishing. So you started off as an indie author, right?
Mhm.
How did that
I
go?
uh, so I I wrote my very first book back in the yesteryear of 2010, and I went online and I googled gay publishers because it had a book with queer characters, and I was clicking through and I clicked on a link for the first one, and I saw that their submission process didn't need an agent or anything like that, so I sent it off, and weirdly it got accepted, and then it got published, and the rest is history. um
So
in
it's easy. It's easy to
Yeah,
get
right,
published.
easy, absolutely easy. Unfortunately, long story short, that publisher turned out to not be on the level where they started defaulting on paying royalties, which is a terrible thing to happen. um, but back in 2016, an agent reached out to me saying that she had read one of my books, and that she said, have you ever considered having representation? And I said, what would you do for me that I can't already do for myself? I've already obviously published these books, and I don't know if why would I need an agent when an agent in my head was thinking I could turn in my book to the same publisher, but you would get part of my money for doing that. So why would I do that? So I said, very polite and firm, thank you, but no thank you. That was the stupidest decision I had ever made in my life. So much so that when I reached this weird plateau internally in my writing career and wanted to just do something different, that I wrote The House in the Cerulean Sea, and I wrote another book, and I went back on my hands and knees and crawled to the same agent and said, "Hey, remember me? I'm back. Hello. And I've written a couple of new books. Maybe you want to read them and see if we can team up." And she said, "Sure, why not?" And then she read the books and said, "Let's sign." And then I signed with her, and literally 2 months later, I had a 6-book contract with Macmillan and Tor. So if you are lucky enough for an agent to reach out to you and say, "Hey, I like your books. Maybe you should consider letting me represent you," don't say no right away. Do not say no. At the very least, do your research about who this agent is and who they are and whatnot. But do not, for the love of God, do what I did. Do not turn them down. But there is a vast and marked difference between indie and traditional publishing. And with indie publishing, there's more of a rush because the books come out much quicker, but with much less budget behind it in terms of marketing. So there's no real fanfare to anything. But I didn't know any better because that's just how I was. So when getting into traditional publishing, I finished The House in the Cerulean Sea in 2018. In the spring of 2018, it didn't come out until 2 years later. So there is that length of time that you have to prepare yourself for. Like I have a book coming out with them in next year, 2022, that I finished also in 2018. So there's like a 4-year difference between that. So traditional publishing, though, I love it. You have to have your expectations absolutely set to know that not everything is going to happen like that. Things take a long time for a very good reason.
Was it hard to wait? Were you thinking, "Oh my God, if I made the wrong decision, I could have had 2 years of book sales by now"?
No, not necessarily, because I decided to do this weird hybrid thing where I found some. This is gonna sound like I'm bragging. I don't mean it this way. I found some pretty good success with self-publishing. Like I was able to build a reader base, a very strong reader base over the years through my books. So when the former publisher I was with went defunct, essentially, I republished all of my own books that used to be with them on my own. I republished my entire catalog, which was like 20 books. And I was only able to do that, though, because I had built that foundation for the last 8 years. And so I was able to, I decided at that point that while I was very happy with traditional publishing and that I loved the having the benefits of being with a big 5 publisher, that I still wanted to do stuff on my own too. I still wanted to be able to write something and self-publish it and get to see that, because, God love a big 5 major traditional publisher, but when you self-publish and you've built an audience and whatnot, you don't owe anyone the money for that. They don't take a percentage or a cut. You don't owe it to the agent or anything like that. And again, this is not something that'll work for everyone. This is just the path that I've been on. But I've been able to keep myself busy during the time of waiting for these books to come out. And it's not like they don't work, maybe, because they do. Because when you sign with a traditional publisher and they have faith in you, they want to build you as a brand. So that means a lot of schmoozing with people. And then finally the big moment comes and your book comes out. And in my case, my book comes out and then the pandemic started. The lockdown hit and everyone went into lockdown the next week after my book came out.
Well, maybe everybody had a lot more time to read.
Yeah, after the panicking of buying all the toilet paper in the world and everything like that. Yeah, it was, but it was so weird because my book came out and I was like, "Hey, everybody, I know you're scared because there's this thing called COVID coming and we don't know what it is exactly, but maybe you want to buy my book." It felt weird to do that, but I still had to do it because that's how it is.
Yeah, and is that part of your contract? Is that built in there that you have to do a certain amount of schmoozing?
No, they basically don't want you to do anything that you're uncomfortable with. But I figured, you know what? If I can quit my job to do this full time if I can write a book that maybe people will like and that gets accepted for publication, then maybe I deserve to be here with all these big name authors, and maybe I deserve to be able to talk to people about my book. And even though if you had come to me a year ago now, like February of 2020, and said that I would be fine speaking to a room of hundreds of people at a time, I would have laughed my ass off, because I have such a panic and a fear of public speaking, or I used to at least. And now I can talk. Obviously, I can talk and talk and talk. So
And so how did you get through that? Because there's in the Facebook group again for this summit, there's been a lot of people talking about how they are uncomfortable engaging with other people. They're very introverted, and
yeah,
this probably is filling them with fear.
let me tell you something. If I am okay with lockdown, because I usually already am in lockdown. This is how I am. I rarely leave my house. That's totally fine. I am such an introverted person. But let me tell you how that changed. It was when my publisher came to me and said, "Hey, so we want you to be able to, we believe in your book. We want you to talk about your book. So here's what you're going to do. You are going to go to this big conference, and you're going to be speaking in front of 200 librarians. And they are the front line. Them and booksellers are the front line for your book. So no pressure or anything." In my head, I got this built up, I remembered my nice, kindly old librarian from when I was a kid, and how lovely she was. And I was thinking, oh, okay, maybe it'll just be like 200 of her and everything like that. And I can do this. And so the night before I had to go give this presentation, this speech and everything like that, I was sitting in the hotel room in Philadelphia, and I was just drenched with flop sweat. I was just like, it was just pouring off of me. And I'm sitting at my computer desk trying to finish up my presentation. And I'm like, this is no good. Nobody's going to like this. Why am I even here? Imposter syndrome, imposter syndrome. And then I looked down, and I had the galley of the house in the Cerulean Sea. And I thought, you know what? Screw it. I wrote this book. I'm proud of this book. I want other people to read this book. So I'm just going to give it my all. And I got up there, and I cannot tell you how it went. I don't remember a single minute of standing in front of those 200 people. But afterwards, I had people come up and say that how happy they were to hear what I was talking about, because I talked about queer people and fantasy and fiction and stuff like that, and how much it meant for them to hear that. And from that moment on, I realized that these people, they're not judging you. They want you to succeed. They want you to be able to tell you about their book. They're not there. Librarians, I know there's a stereotype of the mean librarian and the shh and all of that, but librarians are such wonderful people who love books so, so much. And they want to talk about books. They want to hear authors talk about books. So if you are ever in the position where you're like me and you're an introvert and you're scared of talking to people, just remember that most of the time when you get to talk to people, you're talking to people who want to hear you talk about books and stuff like that, because it's as much as their passion as it is yours.
Yeah, I mean, everyone that's here listening, that's exactly it. Everyone's here to learn from you. They want to hear what you're going to say. And so turn this around. Someday, lots of people in the audience may be sitting in your seat right now. And if they imagine feeling how they're feeling now, maybe that'll
help. And you just have to power through it. You have to keep doing it, because you can either let it hold you back and not put yourself out there like that. But man, I tell you, it is the best thing that I've ever done for my life. And I am one of the biggest introverts. I don't like going outside anything. I need to stay in my own lane and keep my head down like that. But I think that if I had done that, I would have let a lot of things pass me by. And I think that that's not something that I want to do. And you have to make that conscious decision to put yourself out there. And it's the scariest thing you'll ever do. Trust me, it is the scariest thing you'll ever do. But by the time you're finished, man, will you feel exhilaration like nothing else.
Oh, great. I love that. Okay, so I've got a few questions here from people who have been adding them. Sarah wants to know, what, in your opinion, is the most important lesson for writers to learn, and what's the biggest pitfall to avoid?
I think it probably goes back to the editing process, is the divorcing yourself from your word. I have met some writers who will remain nameless that tendency have a to have a tendency to have a chip on their shoulder when it comes to their works and stuff like that. Editing is humbling, man. It is humbling because, and here's the thing too, you're going to get edits back and you're going to think yourself the worst writer in the world. You're going to see so many red comments and squiggly lines and all of that. And you're going to think, this is crap. Everything, what did I do? This is horrible. No, that is not the case at all. Editors want you to be the best you can be. So please let them do their job and don't take it personally. Do not take it personally. However, that being said, don't be a pushover when it comes to your editing too. If there's something that you really believe in, if there's some part of your story that they want to cut or something that they want to change and you feel so strongly about it, bring it up. Will you win? Maybe, maybe not. But you can't you can't let yourself be walked over in the editing process either. You have to remain true to yourself and true to your voice.
Yeah. It's interesting. My kids, when they get their homework marked from school, there's no more red pen for writing. Mm-hmm. When they get feedback, it's all green for growth, trying to get across the idea that this isn't saying that it's wrong. These are areas where you can grow and improve. So green for growth, because it's quite a big change for my son, and it's really changed his mindset to think about it.
Yeah, because when I was a kid, you'd get stuff back on tests and everything was red, wrong. Red. You were wrong and awful and terrible and all of that. This. Yeah, and that's good that they can have that change now, because that really screws with your head when you see stuff like that. Unfortunately, with editing in Word or anything like that, you don't get the green growth comments. Everything is good and wonderful and peachy. You get, this doesn't work. We need to change this. We need to fix this. And but
that is growth. That's green for growth.
Because especially when an editor, the best kind of editor, will say, this doesn't work, here's how we can make it better. Not, this doesn't work, change it. The editor, you and your editor are a team. They are somebody who wants the book to be the best it can be. So they should be giving you feedback rather than just orders. And you should be a collaborative process.
And how important do you think it is to find the right editor for you? Is it like dating?
It's the most important thing that's ever happened. Like, okay, so my editor, Allie, I said before, she's the best thing that could have ever happened in my writing career. And that I absolutely mean that 100%. But she gave me the best piece of writing advice that I have ever gotten, which was the concept of decentralization. And that basically decentralization meaning you have a character and yes, things are happening around them and to them and for them, and to the reader, they may be the main focus, but there are other characters in the book. You have to let other characters shine. You have to let them have their moments in the sun. You can't make it just about the main character. Everybody has to feel lived in and real and everything like that. So you have to decentralize yourself from the main character. You have to make the main character decentralize himself and put others before him sometimes. And that has been just a seismic change for me to be able to hear that. That is the best piece of writing advice I have ever gotten. And I am eternally grateful for her for giving that to me, because she will make me a better writer.
Yeah. Does that help you judge different scenes and whether or not they're relevant and whether or not they're moving the story forward?
Like in my book that comes out in September, it's about ghosts in a tea shop and a man who's died that doesn't want to be dead, and the other man is one who's supposed to help lay him to rest, but he doesn't. They end up falling for each other. It's this whole big love, awesome thing. But when I was writing that story, I was so focused on the main character and his grief of himself dying and stuff like that, that I kind of forgot how it might look to others who can see him and who might be going through the same thing. And it became, for lack of a better word, selfish. He was a selfish character, and I didn't intend for him to be a selfish character, at least not all the way through the book. At the beginning, yes, not all the way through the book, but some of his actions especially towards the end, were selfish. And I didn't see that. I absolutely didn't see that. And so when she said, you need to decentralize him, Wallace, you need to decentralize Wallace, it was like this light clicked on in my head. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense to me. And I was able to go back and change so many things in this book to make it better because of that one piece of advice.
Okay, there's quite a few questions here about finding your readers and building your reader base, especially
Mm-hmm.
if you're self-publishing. How'd you find your readers?
Um, when I started in 2011, there there wasn't necessarily a specific focus on queer characters. I mean, yeah, that's might be surprising to some of you, but yes, even 10 years ago, we didn't have the type of queer characters in fiction that we have today. And there was a market out there. There were some very hungry readers that wanted queer characters. It didn't matter the age. It was young people. It was people my age now in their 30s. It was people older than me that wanted to see themselves represented in fiction. And we didn't get to see queer happiness. We didn't get to see queer success. We for a very long time, queer people in any kind of media were either the offensive over the top sidekick, B, there to act as a very valuable lesson for straight characters, or worse, they got sick or beaten and killed because of who they were. We did not prioritize queer happiness. And I wanted to change that. Was I the first to want to change it? Absolutely not. No way, shape, or form. There was plenty of authors before me that were writing towards the same thing, but I wanted to put my own mark on that. So I think that for me, my first book was not very good. Looking back on it now, I've grown as a writer, and it, to me, a lot of people, I was very lucky for some reason. A lot of people read that book and loved it. But to me, looking back on it now, I kind of cringe at some of the stuff I did in that book in terms of writing. It's imperfect, but it reached an audience that I did not anticipate or expect. And I was able to work through what was my sophomore slump. My second book my first book was a contemporary drama about a family, two queer guys making a family. And my second book was this big science fiction, like huge explosions and all of that. And that landed with a thud, man, because people wanted the same thing that I'd written before.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that sucks. but I didn't let that stop me from writing what I wanted to write. And so I just kept on writing, man. I kept on writing, and for some weird, odd reason, people kept reading my books. And so much so that I was able to get to where I am today.
One thing that I think you do really well is dialogue between your characters,
Mm-hmm.
like banter, just like really realistic characters being funny, having a chat. Here in the UK, you'd say taking the piss out of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what I think you're really good at. How do you write? Do you say it all out loud?
Yeah, actually I do. I have, when people are having conversations in books, there are times when I will read what I've written out loud to make sure I want to write like people talk. People don't talk formally all the time. They absolutely don't. Let me, just a little piece of advice. One thing that will throw me out of a book no matter what is when I'm reading characters interacting, in every sentence they say the other character's name. John, how are you today? John, yeah, I hear you, John. Absolutely, John. That is perfect, John. We don't do that in real life. Think about when you're talking to someone, how often do you say their name? Unless you're getting their attention, you probably don't ever say their name in a conversation, ever. So when you're doing that in your writing and it's happening every other sentence, that is unnatural. It is unnatural, and it shows. And at least for me as a reader, it throws me off when I'm reading something like that. And it's that's such an easy thing to fix. It is such an easy thing to fix to make your dialogue sound more natural. But if you're going for natural dialogue, like I usually tend to do, it really helps to say the dialogue, especially big scenes, big dramatic scenes. It especially helps to say that dialogue out loud to see if you think that's how people would actually talk. And chances are, if you want it to sound like somebody's actually talking in the real world, and you're reading it out loud and it doesn't sound like that, you may need to go back and fix it. But
Yeah.
dialogue, I love dialogue almost more than any other part of writing. I love
But
dialogue.
I feel like your dialogue really feeds into your character development. I'm trying to remember the name of your main character in The Extraordinaries.
Nick Bell.
Yeah, Nick.
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I understand so much more about Nick just because of the way that he talks. Like there's
Yeah.
just a
And
rhythm to his
it
dialogue that
is. And that
tells me
comes
a lot.
from him having ADHD too, like I do. So that was a little easier for me to write a character like that. But writing something that just sounds so believable that when you read it, it sounds like you could have heard anybody, any of your friends, family, or anybody say it. Will just it brings you closer, I think, to the book itself, because you're thinking, even though you know in the back of your mind that these people aren't real that you're reading, maybe they could be.
Yeah. I, I mean, maybe they will be someday. I feel like as I was reading House in the Cerulean Sea, it's very cinematic. Like I
Mm-hmm.
have very clear imagery, even down to the colors. You know, at Linus's office, it's all gray and dingy,
Mm-hmm.
and his home is all gray and dingy. And then he goes to the island, and everything is brilliant and beautiful and in full color. Do
Yeah,
you?
that was my homage to Wizard of Oz, from Dorothy stepping out of Kansas into Oz. I wanted that kind of bright burst of color, because even though everything we see now is color, there's still, when I first saw the Wizard of Oz and going from the sepia toned into that Technicolor world was just in jaw dropping. It was amazing. I'd seen color movies my entire life. It wasn't anything new, but going from
Juxtaposition.
yeah, it just blew me away, and it just made me feel like something in my chest, it just made me feel warm and happy and just blown away. And I wanted to just do my own little homage to that for Linus, going from the city where the rain never stops to this island where everything is color.
Yeah. So you actively were trying to use color and visuals to create that
Mm-hmm.
atmosphere.
Yeah, it was. In terms of it being cinematic, that was kind of intentional, because the look and feel of this world was inspired by a Tim Burton aesthetic. When you're thinking like Sleepy Hollow, or um, every Tim Burton movie, essentially, you're thinking of all the sharp angles and the trees and how everything that they look. But it was also with the aesthetic of Studio Ghibli films, the animation house that does like Spirited Away and Ponyo and all of those movies, Princess Mononoke. They all have a very distinct sense of style. That they very have a distinct aesthetic, that if you saw them without any kind of explanation for what it was, if you know those films, or you would know who they came from. And that's kind of what I wanted for this. I wanted it to have its own unique style and aesthetic, so that if one day it gets translated into film or television, it'll have that basically pre-made to be able to do that with all the sharp angles and the colors and all of that. So
Oh, I love that. I feel like it's yeah. I can imagine the movie already
yeah, me
just
too.
based on what you've written.
One day I'm gonna
Come
get this done, let
on,
me tell you.
I want to see it. Um, so a couple of people have asked you about your ADHD. Can you talk about how that helps you and hinders you when you're writing?
Writing, writing is the best thing that's ever happened to my ADHD. And I'm saying that above therapy. I'm saying that above medication. I'm saying that above anything else. But please, if you need to go to therapy, and please take your medication. It's so important too.
It's not a
But
replacement.
writing, as you can tell by the way I move and the way I talk, my brain moves really fast, really fast. I have a billion thoughts at once. Even right now, I'm thinking of a few other things that are going on around. But writing narrows that to a laser pinpoint focus. When I'm writing, I don't think about anything else but what I'm doing. And that, to me, has been the best medicine. Again, please take your medicine prescribed by your doctor and all of that. But for me, writing has been just something that has helped my ADHD be able to I won't say relax, but be able to work for me rather than against me. Because with my ADHD, I'm thinking of all these different plot points all at once, and I can go there very quickly when I'm writing, and I can write very, very fast. And it's helped me. It has become, when I was a kid, it was a thing that I hated because it made me an other. I had an otherness about me. And when you're a kid and you have an otherness, that's the worst thing in the world because you want to be like everybody else. But when you grow up and you learn that it's not the death sentence you think it is, because a kid with ADHD becomes a teenager with ADHD who becomes an adult with ADHD. And I learned how to use it for me rather than against me. And writing is the best thing for my ADHD because it gives me hope and purpose, and it allows me to not have a billion things going on at once because I'm focusing on just the writing aspect of it.
But you have lots of different projects going on at the same time that you jump
No,
between?
I can't do
No,
that. I have to
you're
do
one at a
one
time.
thing at a time. I only write one thing at a time. And God bless all of you that can do that, because and people that can read more than one book at a time. I don't know how you do that, because that just
I would want to.
right, exactly. And so I am a one project person at a time. If I'm editing, I'm not writing. I'm just editing. I do not write at all because it just ruins my focus. But one project at a time, always. I can't do multiple things at once.
All right, we are basically out of time. So thank you so much for that. We still have tons of questions here. So this replay will go out to everybody, I think later today or tomorrow morning. And then after that, it will just be available as part of the ProWritingAid University. We may have it on YouTube occasionally as when times allow for it. But I just want to say thank you so much.
Well,
I feel
thank
like
you
we've
so
learned
much
a ton.
for having me here. And to everybody watching, whether you're writing your first book or your 25th book, you can do it. You can absolutely do it. Because if I can do it, pretty much anyone can, let me tell you. But believe in yourself, believe in your stories, and just, with a little bit of luck, you can maybe hopefully one day get to be in this weird position that I get to be in right now. So I wish you all the best.
Find your champions. You have your teachers, you have your editor,
yes.
You've got those people that support you.
Always find somebody to champion you, because there will be days when you're so hard on yourself for what you're writing. You have that imposter syndrome. You think all of what you're doing is crap. Find someone to champion you, because, you'll need that one day. You will absolutely need that. And look at me, I'm 38 years old and I still remember what my 7th grade English teachers told me, because that has stuck with me forever.
I love that. Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, TJ, for being here. We really appreciate it. Everybody go and buy all of TJ's books.
Yes, please. All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thanks. Bye.